Mrs. Guthrie had cameras plural at this home and that they were smashed. You may have heard Brian Entin from News Nation talking earlier and asking Sheriff Chris Nanos a question in the news conference, and again today I'm recording on February the 3rd, it's a Tuesday. The press conference that was early in the day, Brian asked the sheriff the camera on the front of the house is missing, and the sheriff said we are trying to get into the companies that are providers of this kind of cloud information to get that, and said, music by today? He did not have that information, did not have whatever was recorded. But I can tell you they are Nest cameras. They are Nest cameras plural, and that whoever did this may have smashed those cameras plural. So they're not there presumably because law enforcement took those smashed cameras as evidence. My law enforcement source told me that police have now towed and impounded the vehicle belonging to Nancy Guthrie's daughter, Annie Guthrie. Walking up to the front door, you could see that there was blood right outside the front door on the ground, like on the stoop right there, right near the front map going in. Just, not a ton of blood, but it was definitely blood. It was all right there. Nancy Guthrie had a pacemaker and it disconnected from her Apple devices, her Apple Watch, her Apple phone, which were left in the home at about 2 in the morning. And that is a significant time, and I'll tell you why, that it is extraordinarily instructive music to this investigation. Nest cameras smashed, multiple cameras, not one, plural. Whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home knew those cameras existed and knew where they were positioned. They smashed them deliberately, eliminating the visual record of their entry before proceeding with the abduction of an 84-year-old woman who could barely walk 50 yards on their own. And the back door was left wide open. A journalist who has known Savannah Guthrie for 20 years received information from an impeccable law enforcement source with direct knowledge of the investigation. What that source revealed goes beyond what any press conference has disclosed. Blood confirmed inside the house, a family member's vehicle towed and impounded as evidence, and the investigative focus narrowing in a direction that has shaken everyone connected to the case. My law enforcement source tells me that the back door of the Guthrie home was the door that was left wide open. Was it the point of entry? Was it the point of egress? Don't know that. But it was open, wide open, and it was in the back, not the front. Brian Entin saw blood at the front door. So, did a struggle happen at the front door? Was there a doorbell rung at 2 a.m.? Why was the back door open? Lot of questions there, but the back door, according to my law enforcement source, was left wide open. Back door wide open. Blood at the front door, 2 separate locations, 2 separate pieces of evidence that suggest a sequence of events moving through the house. Entry from one direction, exit from another, and a confrontation somewhere in between that produced the blood that Brian Entin found on the front stoop when he walked up to a house that was no longer a crime scene. The crime scene had been released to the family after approximately 24 hours of processing. The tape came down. Law enforcement vehicles departed, and when Entin approached the front door to knock, he found blood on the ground near the front mat. Visible, still red, not cleaned, not covered, just sitting there on the stoop of a house that had been turned back over to the family the evening before. And above the door, where a Nest camera had been mounted near what appeared to be a doorbell position, the camera was gone. An investigative reporter confirmed that the cameras were Nest cameras, not Ring cameras, as had been previously reported. They were smashed, not simply removed or disconnected. The physical act of smashing implies tools, implies force, implies someone who arrived prepared to destroy surveillance equipment before the kidnapping began. And whoever did it knew there were multiple cameras, not just one. That level of familiarity with the property's security infrastructure points towards someone who had been inside or around the home before. The pacemaker data provides the timestamp. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker was connected to her Apple Watch and Apple phone via Bluetooth. When the pacemaker moves out of Bluetooth range from those devices, which were left inside the home, the connection breaks. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, that disconnection occurred. Not because the pacemaker stopped working, not because Nancy died, because the person wearing the pacemaker was physically moved out of range of the devices it was paired with. That is the moment investigators believe Nancy was taken from her house. And if you want to follow how the camera evidence, the blood analysis, and the pacemaker timeline converge, make sure you're subscribed, because in this case, every update has changed what we thought we knew. This is important because you've heard that the last point of contact with Nancy Guthrie was when she was dropped off by her daughter at 9:45-ish at night on Saturday night. So Annie Guthrie and possibly her husband as well, Tommaso Cioni, were the last people to see her at 9:45 at night, Saturday night. Sunday morning, 11 o'clock a.m., church members reach out to the family. Hey, your mom wasn't in church, not normal? She's always there. What's up? Family member goes over, calls family member remembers, goes to the house, calls 911, and the investigation begins. But they have towed Annie Guthrie's car. Annie Guthrie's vehicle has been towed and impounded, placed into evidence. Annie is Nancy Guthrie's daughter, Savannah's sister, and the family member who dropped Nancy off at her home the evening before the disappearance. She and her husband, Thomas Ossian, were the last people known to have seen Nancy alive. And their car, the vehicle Nancy was riding in when she was brought home that evening, is now in law enforcement custody. The law enforcement source described the investigative logic directly. Who takes an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility? It is a burden for a kidnapper. An elderly woman who cannot walk more than 50 yards, who needs daily medication to survive, who has no capacity to be forced to move quickly or far. Taking her is not the act of a burglar who was surprised and improvised. It is the act of someone who had a specific reason to want this particular woman to disappear. And investigators look at people who would have a benefit from that disappearance. Insurance benefits, debts, financial entanglements. The source identified Nancy Guthrie's husband as someone investigators were looking at closely, possibly as a prime suspect in the earliest phase of the investigation. The source was careful to note that families are always examined first. The concentric circles of investigation begin at the center, the people closest to the victim, and expand outward. Ed Smart was investigated in the disappearance of his daughter Elizabeth before it was discovered that a stranger, Brian David Mitchell, had entered the home and taken her. The process is standard, it is necessary. And it does not always mean that the family member being examined is guilty, but towing and impounding a vehicle is a loud move. It is not a routine interview. It is not a voluntary DNA swab. It is the seizure of physical evidence under legal authority. And the question the law enforcement source raised is whether investigators would take that step, towing the car of Savannah Guthrie's sister, generating the media attention and family disruption that inevitably follows, unless there was something more substantial driving the decision. This isn't like a normal neighborhood, actually. It's right in the foothills. Every house I would say, is on at least an acre, maybe 2, 3, or 4 acres. They're almost like little ranches. And it's pitch. We've got our lights on for, because we're doing our camera work, but it's pitch black out here. There is not one light out here. Music. And, it's a ways to the next house. So I'm just thinking if they came in through the back door to leave to take her out the back door, though, it's not like there'd be a little alley back there. I mean, there's like cactus. This is not, it's like kind of wildland out here. It's pitch black, no streetlights, properties between 1 and 4 acres each. Wildland behind the homes. Cactus, brush, desert terrain that is not designed for pedestrian movement, especially not at 2 o'clock in the morning with an 84-year-old woman who needs assistance walking. The environment itself constrains the possibilities. Whoever took Nancy needed a vehicle close to the house because she could not have been walked any significant distance. And the darkness that should have provided cover for the perpetrator also eliminates the kind of ambient light that residential security cameras rely on to capture usable footage. The Nest cameras were the primary defense and they were destroyed. Not circumvented, not blocked with a hand or a piece of tape, smashed. Which means the footage they captured before being smashed, the approach, the first moments of the perpetrator's presence at the house, may exist on the Nest Cloud servers if the cameras were transmitting before they were destroyed. At the time of the interview, law enforcement was still waiting for the Nest Corporation to provide access to whatever data those cameras transmitted before they went offline. The sheriff expressed frustration at the delay. 72 hours had passed and the camera data still had not been delivered. Blood inside the house, blood outside the house, the back door wide open, Nest cameras smashed, a pacemaker disconnecting at 2 o'clock a.m., a family vehicle towed into evidence, cell phone pings and geofencing data being analyzed to determine every device that was in the vicinity during the window of the abduction. And a neighborhood so dark and so spread out that the usual tools of investigation, ring cameras on neighboring houses, traffic cameras on public roads, the ambient visibility that helps witnesses notice things that are out of place, may not yield what they normally would. The sheriff would not confirm forced entry during the press conference, but the law enforcement source, Music, confirmed it definitively. There was absolutely forced entry. The sheriff would not confirm the blood, but Brian Entin found it at the front door, still visible, still red, on a surface that had been released from crime scene status the day before, and the law enforcement source confirmed blood inside the house as well. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, a mother. Her Nest cameras were smashed by someone who knew where they were. Her back door was left wide open. Her blood was found inside and outside her home. Her pacemaker disconnected from her devices at 2 o'clock in the morning. Her medication was left behind, medication that the sheriff described as potentially fatal to be without for more than 24 hours. And her daughter's car has been towed into evidence while investigators examine every person who had access to this house, this woman, and this family. If you have any information, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department at 520-351-4900. The reward currently exceeds $1.2 million. This story is far from over. Subscribe now because in this case, every update has changed what we thought we knew. This content is analytical, based on publicly available sources, for informational and awareness purposes only. It does not represent official conclusions. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent until proven guilty. Viewers should consult additional independent sources for a complete perspective. The deeper investigators dig into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the more the timeline begins to fracture into pieces that no longer fit the image of a random home invasion. Because random offenders do not usually arrive prepared to disable multiple cameras. They do not target elderly victims with extensive medical vulnerabilities, and they do not operate with the kind of precision that this scene increasingly suggests. What investigators appear to be facing is something far more organized, far more personal, and possibly far more calculated than anyone initially imagined. And one detail in particular keeps resurfacing behind closed doors. The timeline between 9:45 p.m. and 2 o'clock a.m., that window is becoming the entire case. 5 hours. 5 hours in which Nancy Guthrie returned home, settled in for the night, and then vanished without a trace except for blood evidence, destroyed surveillance equipment, and a digital heartbeat that suddenly disappeared from Bluetooth range. Because remember, investigators do not just have witness testimony. They do not just have assumptions. They have device telemetry. They have timestamps. They have movement data. They have forensic extraction reports coming from phones, watches, vehicles, routers, and potentially cloud systems connected to the property itself. And that means every minute inside that 5-hour gap matters. Did Nancy make phone calls after arriving home? Did her Apple Watch record movement? Did lights inside the house activate during the night? Did motion sensors trigger? Did nearby cellular devices connect to the home Wi-Fi even briefly? These are the kinds of invisible questions modern investigations now answer. The public often imagines criminal investigations as interviews and interrogations, but today, major cases are reconstructed digitally first. Detectives build timelines through technology before they ever accuse someone face-to-face. And that is why the smash Nest cameras may ultimately become one of the biggest mistakes the perpetrator made. Because destroying a camera does not necessarily destroy what the camera already uploaded. If the cameras captured even 10 seconds of footage before they were disabled, investigators may already possess the single most important evidence in the case. A silhouette, a vehicle, a familiar walk, a voice, a timestamp, anything. And according to investigators familiar with smart home systems, Nest cameras continuously buffer and transmit data to cloud servers, which means the offender may have believed smashing the physical devices eliminated the evidence when in reality the footage may already have been preserved remotely. That possibility changes everything, especially if the person approaching the home was someone Nancy knew. Because there is another aspect of this case that investigators reportedly keep circling back toward. There were no reports of neighbors hearing screams, no reports of gunshots, no reports of prolonged struggle noises echoing through the desert foothills during the middle of the night. That silence matters. An 84-year-old woman being abducted by a stranger from her own home would likely create chaos unless the victim either trusted the individual initially or was incapacitated very quickly. And that brings investigators to another uncomfortable possibility. What if Nancy opened the door willingly? What if the blood at the front entrance was not the beginning of the event but the middle of it? Imagine the sequence detectives may now be considering. A knock at the door sometime after midnight. Someone familiar. Someone Nancy recognized. Someone she had no immediate fear of allowing inside. Conversation. Movement through the house. Then something changes. An argument. A confrontation. An injury. Blood appears. The cameras are destroyed either immediately before or immediately after the escalation. Then Nancy is removed through the rear exit where visibility from the street would be lower. Suddenly, the physical evidence begins aligning into a coherent flow. Front door interaction, interior struggle, rear exit departure, and the darkness of the surrounding terrain would have provided cover for a waiting vehicle positioned behind the home or along a less visible access route. Investigators are also reportedly examining whether the offender understood Nancy's medical condition in detail. That matters because taking someone dependent on medication creates a ticking clock. Whoever removed Nancy from that house either did not care whether she survived long-term or believed the situation would conclude quickly. The sheriff himself emphasized the seriousness of Nancy being without medication for even 24 hours. That statement was not accidental. Law enforcement rarely emphasizes medical dependency publicly unless they believe it directly relates to the urgency of the crime. And then there is the pacemaker data. The pacemaker may ultimately become one of the most devastating witnesses in the entire investigation. Because unlike people, digital systems do not panic. They do not forget. They do not misremember times. If the Bluetooth disconnect occurred at approximately 2 o'clock a.m., investigators can now anchor the abduction timeline around that moment with remarkable confidence. That means anyone whose movements cannot be accounted for during that window immediately enters a far narrower circle of scrutiny. Cell tower records, vehicle GPS systems, automatic toll readers, traffic cameras miles away from the residence, location sharing applications. Even modern vehicle infotainment systems often store trip history and phone pairing records. People do not realize how many digital breadcrumbs they leave behind, and investigators absolutely know how to follow them, which may explain why certain individuals connected to the family are reportedly lawyering up quickly. Now, to be absolutely clear, retaining legal counsel is not evidence of guilt. In high-profile cases, especially those involving intense media attention, attorneys are often retained immediately simply to protect privacy and avoid misstatements. But investigators are not relying on public appearances. They are relying on evidence, and the evidence appears to be pulling them steadily toward the people closest to Nancy's daily life. Financial records are reportedly becoming another major focus, because when investigators examine motive in disappearances involving elderly victims, they often look first at dependency structures. Who benefits financially? Who carried debt? Who had access to assets? Who stood to gain from life insurance, inheritance changes, trust distributions, or real estate transfers? And importantly, had there been recent disputes involving money? These questions are standard in investigations involving elderly victims, especially when the disappearance appears targeted rather than opportunistic. Detectives reportedly are now combing through months of banking activity connected not only to Nancy but potentially to people around her. Unusual withdrawals, large transfers, missed payments, loan pressures, property issues, everything. Because financial desperation has driven countless crimes that initially appeared inexplicable. And if investigators uncover mounting pressures surrounding someone close to Nancy, that becomes highly relevant. There is also growing attention surrounding the psychological profile required to commit a crime like this. This was not impulsive, at least not according to the evidence currently known publicly. Whoever entered that home either arrived prepared to disable cameras or decided extraordinarily quickly to do so. They moved through the property with enough confidence to avoid immediate detection, and they removed a medically fragile elderly woman from a dark, rural-style neighborhood without attracting attention. That requires composure, planning, control, even if the original intent was something else entirely. Some investigators may now be considering whether the event escalated unexpectedly after entry. For example, was the original purpose confrontation rather than abduction? Did something occur inside the house that forced a rapid decision? Could the blood evidence indicate an injury that changed the offender's plan mid-event? Because one question still haunts this case. Why take Nancy at all? If robbery was the motive, why not leave after confrontation? If violence occurred accidentally, why not flee? Why remove the victim entirely? The answer investigators may fear is simple, because leaving Nancy alive inside the home would have identified the offender immediately. And if that theory is correct, then this was never random, not even for a second. The geofencing warrants investigators are reportedly pursuing may also become critical. For those unfamiliar, geofencing allows investigators to identify devices present within a defined geographic area during a specific time window. In other words, law enforcement can potentially determine which mobile devices were near Nancy's home between late Saturday night and early Sunday morning. That does not automatically identify suspects, but it can eliminate innocent explanations quickly. Whose phone appeared near the residence unexpectedly? Whose device suddenly stopped transmitting? Whose movements contradict their statements? These are the silent battles happening behind investigative doors right now. And if the perpetrator attempted to leave their phone elsewhere to create an alibi, investigators may still identify other digital traces. Vehicle systems, smartwatch movement, license plate readers, gas station surveillance. The modern world is extraordinarily difficult to disappear inside completely, especially after a major crime. Then there is the emotional dimension of the case that continues gripping the public. Nancy Guthrie was not living an isolated life. She attended church consistently. Neighbors knew her routines. Family members remained in regular contact. This was someone deeply embedded within a predictable social structure. And when people with highly structured routines suddenly vanish, investigators immediately focus on disruptions. Who knew her habits? Who knew when she would be alone? Who knew the house layout? Who knew about the cameras? Who knew her medical limitations? The overlap between those categories may ultimately become the center of the prosecution's case if arrests are eventually made. Meanwhile, public pressure continues mounting on investigators to provide updates. But law enforcement often becomes quieter, not louder, when a case begins tightening around specific individuals. And some observers believe that may already be happening here. Because despite enormous media coverage, investigators have released remarkably little hard evidence publicly. That restraint can sometimes signal uncertainty, but it can also signal confidence. confidence that suspects are being monitored, confidence that digital evidence is still being assembled, confidence that premature disclosure could compromise future charges. One former investigator explained it this way: when police stop talking, sometimes it means they are finally seeing the outline clearly. And perhaps the most chilling possibility investigators are considering is whether Nancy was alive for some period after leaving the home, because the absence of immediate discovery raises difficult questions. Was she transported elsewhere, held temporarily, moved between locations, or was the removal itself intended primarily to delay discovery of what had already occurred inside the residence? Those possibilities dramatically expand investigative complexity. Search teams reportedly continue examining remote terrain, abandoned properties, and travel corridors throughout the region. Cadaver dogs, aerial support, ground searches, digital mapping, every available method. But despite all of it, Nancy remains missing, and that fact alone continues tormenting both investigators and the public, because without Nancy, key answers remain out of reach. The exact sequence inside the home, the identity of the offender, the motive, the timeline after 2 a.m. Everything depends on reconstructing events from fragments: blood, data, destroyed cameras, vehicle evidence, digital movement patterns, witness timelines, and increasingly, investigators appear to believe those fragments may point towards someone who knew exactly what they were doing, or at least someone who believed they could outmaneuver the system. But cases involving digital evidence often turn slowly before turning suddenly. One recovered message, one GPS discrepancy, one deleted search history entry, one surveillance frame, one overlooked witness. That is all it takes sometimes for an entire investigation to collapse inward around a suspect. And as forensic analysts continue processing the evidence seized in this case, including the impounded vehicle tied to a close family member, the pressure behind the scenes is almost certainly intensifying. Because towing a vehicle is only the beginning. Vehicles contain fibers, DNA, touch evidence, location history, Bluetooth pairings, navigation records, potential trace blood evidence invisible to the human eye. Even microscopic particles transferred from desert terrain can become evidentiary links. If investigators believe that vehicle potentially intersected with Nancy's disappearance timeline, they will dismantle its forensic history piece by piece. Nothing will be overlooked, not in a case this visible, not in a case involving a reward exceeding $1 million. And certainly not in a case where public confidence now hinges on whether law enforcement can explain how an elderly woman vanished from her own home despite cameras, devices, routines, and family proximity. Because right now, the biggest question is no longer whether Nancy Guthrie was specifically targeted. The evidence increasingly suggests she was. The real question is why. What happened inside that house between 9:45 p.m. and 2 a.m. that led to smashed cameras, blood evidence, and the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman into the darkness of the Arizona foothills? Investigators may already know more than they are saying, and if they do, the silence itself may be telling us something. Because in investigations like this, the moment before an arrest often looks eerily calm from the outside. No dramatic announcements, no leaks, no visible movement, just quiet. And somewhere behind that quiet, detectives continue building the final version of the timeline minute by minute, device by device, contradiction by contradiction, until eventually someone's story stops matching the evidence.